Timothée de Carvalho. So Raoul is actually deputy head of the quant research group at BNP Paribas Asset Management. His team is responsible for supporting research development of systematic strategies using big data just to try to support alpha sources. Raoul is very senior, got more than 22 years experience in quantitative investment experience. And I discovered, in fact, a few days before that Raoul, in fact, got another life before quantitative investment. So he earned a PhD in theoretical physics from University of Bristol, got MSc in condensed matter physics, a BSc in chemistry. So you can see that there are different paths, in fact, to venture in quantitative finance. And we are very, very fortunate to have Raoul today. Raoul is based in Paris, and he will talk today about how, in fact, to estimate non-reported corporate carbon emission using machine learning. So without further ado, let me turn to Raoul. Raoul, thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Hello. So today, I mean, it's really a great pleasure to talk to you about the work we have been doing on machine learning for predicting carbon emissions. So we can just go to the next slide, where essentially we give the motivations for this work. So, I mean, we are an asset manager. We are at BNP Paribas Asset Management. So why do we spend time constructing machine learning models to estimate carbon emissions? So if we go to the slide before, I mean, essentially, as an asset manager, fund managers do need to know about company greenhouse gas emissions. These days, I mean, asset managers acknowledge the need to accelerate the transition towards net zero. In fact, there is the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. So this is in slide 2, the previous slide. There are 301 asset managers which sign to the Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative, which is actually with a total of $59 trillion under assets under management, that will essentially have to converge to zero emissions by 2050. That's the commitment of the asset managers. There's also the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. It has 550 members from the financial industry, from 7 specific net zero alliances. So yes, the financial industry is now committed towards reaching net zero by 2050. And the only way to do it, well, you have to know the emissions of the companies, because you finance companies, you invest in companies, and you do need to know about how much they are, how much of the emissions are they responsible for. So that's one of the reasons for essentially our strategy, and to know how we're going to continue to invest and to finance companies. The second reason is because companies with higher carbon emissions face higher regulatory and legal risks. So, I mean, just from a risk management point of view, and when we decide to invest in companies, it is important to know how high the carbon emissions are. The other reason is also because increasingly our investors have not just financial utility, but they also have sustainability utility, and they want to have a positive impact on environment through their investments. So it's actually our clients that also are asking us to take action when it comes to build portfolios, and in some cases they do want to have very specific constraints related on how they build their portfolios, and constraints in particular related to carbon emissions and decarbonization. So these are some of the main reasons that why we need to have carbon emissions from corporates. Now the issue is, and I will show that in a minute, is that there's not that much published data. In fact, a lot of the data that exists tends to be estimated. And what we found a few years back is that the models that they use by a number of data vendors perhaps not of the quality we would like to have. So that's why we really embarked on this journey of calculating ourselves, to have a tool that will allow us either to have numbers or to actually just check the quality of the data vendor, so you can use in different ways. And so far what we have done is produced a model for scope 1 and scope 2. So I'll talk about that. So if we now indeed move to the okay, we can stay on this slide. Sorry, we can go back to the slide. So when you talk about carbon emissions, what are we really talking about? Well, first, there's the greenhouse gas protocol, which was essentially proposed in 2015, and these days is what is mostly used, and sees essentially the emission of greenhouse gases as we have in this slide. First, it's not just CO2. I mean, what it's done is there's a way of converting emissions of other gases like methane and so on into a weight of equivalent CO2. And the way that is done is by, well, it's known what is the warming power of different gases. So you can calculate an equivalent of how much weight of those gases in terms of emissions is to 1 ton of CO2. So you have a way of converting emissions of methane and other greenhouse gases into an equivalent weight of emissions of CO2. And that's essentially what is used. So when we talk about carbon emissions, usually we talk about equivalent CO2 emissions, which means all these gases that are here in this slide, they have the weights converted into equivalents of CO2 emissions. Then we have CO2 equivalent. That's what we really talk about. And then I already mentioned scope 1, scope 2, and there's something which is scope 3. So what are these? Essentially, according to this protocol, the carbon emissions and those of all the gases are divided into different scopes. And when we talk about scope 1, essentially we're talking about the direct emissions from a company that typically come from what is known as stationary combustion, which can be burning oil, gas, coal, and other things in boilers, furnaces, but essentially by the company itself for its operations. It can be also mobile combustion from the cars and vans and the trucks controlled by the firm, or owned by the firm, and can be process emissions, for example, if it involves chemical production or the equipment that releases CO2, for example, cement manufacturing. So this is also included, and also includes fugitive emissions, which can come from, for example, leaking. In the case of methane, that's really a critical issue. So I mean, but these are direct emissions from the company itself. Then you have scope 2, and scope 2 is indirect emissions. They're typically associated with the electricity that is purchased by the company, or steam, or heat, or cooling, or but essentially is what is bought indirectly by the company. And this is what is scope 1, scope 2, and then there's scope 3. Scope 3 is essentially all the rest. It's also the more complete and more complicated. It can also be the bigger, much bigger than scope 1 and scope 2 added together. And scope 3 involves what is known as upstream activities and downstream activities. And essentially is everything that is in the supply chain of the company and that is not direct or indirect. So, I mean, you can see, for example, employee commuting is part of scope 3. You can see other things that are part of scope 3 includes the fuel from related activities, the transportation, distribution, bring materials for essentially the production, the purchase goods, for example, that generate emissions. And then downstream is essentially from the products, the emissions from the products, or from the distribution of the products, from the recycling of products. So all that, and if there's essentially 15 of those scope 3, depending on how you really put it together. So that's what we call carbon emissions. Now, if we go to the next slide, in slide 4, we have, this is the picture on 2018 December, that's because of what we use for the calculations. Today, there's a few more companies publishing data, but what we have in here is the number of companies that provide already reported data on emissions. And if we take
Raoul, if I may, in terms of the universe, so when you mean broad global universe, so what are you talking about? Are there only...
Yeah, so I mean, if you go through all our funds, you find potentially these 15,726 companies, or at least you would back then when we started the analysis. And so if we want to report on every single company we can buy into our funds, that's our investment universe. So that's what we mean 17,000. Of course, I mean, it includes a lot of micro companies and a lot of small companies. You can see there's the 3,000 largest cap universe. That's for the largest cap funds. Of course, you go on a small universe. We also have what is available in Bloomberg, where in terms of the universe they consider, which is 11,700. So the issue is we potentially can invest in, or you could, it's probably more even now, back then on investing 15,726 companies. And when we look at what we have reported, we had only about 18% of scope 1 and about 17% of scope 2 reported, and scope 3 even less, only 12%. But even if we go for the large caps of the companies that appear in our mainstream funds, or flagship funds, which are invested typically in the largest capitalization, so talking about the 3,000 largest market capitalization stocks, you can see that still it's less than, or it was at the time, less than half that were actually reporting. And on scope 3, it was only 33%. So even for those funds, I mean, if you're faced with a decision, do I want this company or that, your criteria is carbon emissions, you can see, I mean, you really have a problem because you don't have the data for half of your universe. So it's not fair. I mean, you can say, well, then I don't invest. But if you say I don't invest, you just forget about well, most of 80% of our investment universe, you're really throwing it in the bin, which also is not something that we want to do. I mean, I'm sure there's good companies that do not have a lot of carbon emissions there. So I mean, this was what we were confronted with, and that's why we embarked on this. The second reason we embarked on this is because when we ask some data vendors to extend, because they use models to estimate missing data, so they have more coverage, but it's based on their own models. And what we realize is that most of the data vendors, when we talk to them, in particular back then, I mean, this also has been changing, but in particular back then, they had extremely simple models, typically linear models, which based on very few variables, typically size, number of employees, and sometimes it just stopped there. And so, I mean, there was this other problem that when we started looking, we realized that the models that some data vendors had were really not very sophisticated and not that powerful, and they were far from what we wanted to have. Because I mean, our objective is indeed to be have leader on sustainability and sustainable investing. So that's why we embarked on this on constructing these models. And also back then, I mean, we talked to in particular some academics from the University of Otago at one of the GRASFIC conferences, and we realized that they were using machine learning. It's based on the discussion that we came up with this way of modeling. So if we go to the next slide, I just mentioned what some academics were doing back then. And in slide 5, we show what we have changed relative to the models that existed previously based on machine learning. When we looked at the paper they presented at the conference and that eventually they published, we realized that, well, we can go to the, yes, exactly. So we realized that their effort was on developing essentially one model per industry, and sometimes if there was not enough data, they were kind of putting some industries together in terms of GIGS 3, GIGS 2 levels and so on. So they had a way of putting together industries based on availability of data and what they could do, but they're really aiming at one model per industry. That was their aim. And what we realized is that some industries, for example, insurances, the predictions of the models they were putting together out of sample were really poor. So I mean, and also they were using machine learning models, using a methodology which essentially just throw everything that we can from machine learning algorithms and let's really try to pick up the best and construct something, which for us was a problem because I mean, for us having some transparency of what is going on is also very important. Not just forecasting precise numbers, but knowing why we're precising forecast numbers, because we have to explain why we're doing and what we're doing. When you rely on the data vendor, you can say, well, rely on the data vendor, the model perhaps is not good, but you just say that. If we're going to forecast ourselves, we have to say also why we're forecasting in a particular way and why we have carbon emissions in one way, which was a challenge. So what we opted, it was first, we decided why not create a global model and just use sectors as an input. And we realized that that works really quite well and solves the problems of out of sample predictability in the industries or sectors that previously were not good, like insurances. We actually can get quite large R squares in the results, in the validation, in the test sample. So that's what we went for. And then also one of the things that we realized that was extremely important was to correct errors in the reported data that we were using to construct the model. So back when we started this was done iteratively. I mean, every time we run a version of the model, we also detected the companies that were really outside what in the test sample that were really outside where we wanted to be. Both in the test and validation samples. And we looked at why the data was really far out. And we realized that there were errors in reporting. And we could do that just by going actually to check what the companies had published. And we finally, sometimes the numbers had not been updated. Sometimes there were corporate actions that had not been taken. And so by correcting those, we actually managed also to improve the model. And in the paper, we describe still the fact that we did this by hand. Today, we have an automated version for doing this. But that is very important. If you train a model on bad data, you will get a not necessarily good model. If you train the model on good data, of course, the chances you get a good model are really significantly higher. So that's something we've learned as we went on, is that the reported data as we get it contains errors, and being able to correct those errors for corporate actions, for misreported data, and really going and looking at where the data has changed really significantly from one year to the other without any apparent reason. Then we decided to just omit some of this data if we could not find an explanation or correct the data or something. So those, the main two innovations is indeed by switching to a global model with sectors and industries as predictors and correcting the data. And I would say the simplification of just choosing the machine learning algorithms, limiting to just, in the case of the paper, two algorithms, and in the case of real life now, we actually finally focus just on one. I will talk about that. So this is the first part of the model, is that is a global model, and we do the data cleaning, and we pay a lot of attention to that. In terms of what goes into the model, we can go to slide 6, and we have essentially a number of predictors. A lot of them were inspired already in what academics were doing. We completed here and there, and essentially this is the data set. So as I mentioned, I mean, we have industry classifications, which is a categorical predictor. We have regions, as you have there. We have the revenue group, whether it's a high income or upper middle income, so on, also as a categorical predictor. We have whether there's tax regulations or not. And then we go into the numerical data, where there we have the CO2 emissions, we have carbon intensity of energy mix, and we have a number of other things related also to carbon emissions. Then we have something specific to company, but not just revenues and number of employees. We also added things like total assets, gross property, capex, age of assets. And finally, also we added variables which depends on the essentially related to the energy production and energy consumption. So this is what we tested. I mean, there were more predictors that were tested In the paper, we really only mentioned what was finally retained for the final version of the model. So this is what we work with. Although, I mean, there was actually a few more things that have been tested, but they were not really retained by the model. So we decided just not to talk too much about those. And everything is done in log terms. As you will see, I mean, carbon emissions, they can increase quite fast. So we deal with log terms. So for the numerical variables, typically, most of them are also in logs. So we regress logs on logs when we construct the models, or we model machine learning in terms of logs, because that gives is as it was done and as it's done by most people, because the data, if you look at it just as it is really not Gaussian distributed. But if you look at the logs, then you find something really close to Gaussian distributions. So that's why in these models, you model the logs. So in the next slide, we talk a bit more about the machine learning approaches that we have used. So we chose to use a linear model, in particular because when we started this, we really wanted to have something that would tell us a bit why the model is doing what it is. And when you have a linear component, that becomes easier. At least you can look at what the linear component is doing. And we went for elastic nets. I mean, we could have done many of the others, but elastic nets is essentially gives you the compromise between the ridge regularization and the lasso regularization. So an L2 and an L1. And it creates essentially the best compromise between using both. So that's a kind of standard choice for a linear model. And that's finally what we went on. Now the predictions are quite easy to explain. What is the issue is not as accurate as non-linear models. And for the non-linear models, from all the things that we could use, finally we settled for using what is known as extremely randomized trees, which is essentially a version of random forests with a number of simplifications, in particular on the way that you do the split. Which are random, as not really chose to be optimal, and that makes it more economical in terms of computing time. So that's what we went for, and indeed, I mean, we find that it tends to be more accurate. But when we actually wrote this first paper, well, the problem is we could not figure out how to actually come up with an explanation of why we were getting the numbers we were getting. Now, in the meantime, we started using something which is known as Shapley values. So in the meantime, we actually dropped the linear model. We just used a non-linear regression model and we used Shapley values and to essentially find out why a certain why we get a certain prediction from the model. And I will talk that at the end, because that's something that we've done just recently. So, but on this model, as it was presented, I mean, also we decided to go for a conservative combination. We could have just picked the best model or the best result of the model, but mainly because the regulator also wants carbon estimations in cases of uncertainty to be conservative. So actually, we not went for the best of the best estimations. We went for a compromise. So essentially we just took what we call the maximum prediction combination, which is we just take the biggest value from the results that we get, which is not necessarily the one that gives going to get the best fit, but it's what we chose, and this well can be changed. And what we do now we go for the best fit, but when we wrote the model, this paper, that's what we went for. So if we go to the next slide, I think it's interesting to spend a little bit of time on how these things are set up, or how we did set them up. So we first separate the universe into in sample and out of sample. In out of sample, we essentially put all the companies not reporting, or all the companies for which we realized that the data had problems because it changed too much, or there's something we really couldn't understand. So everything that was excluded was put on the side. And what we did we're going to show at the end is we compare our estimates for those companies that are excluded because they don't have emissions, or because the emissions we don't think they are good, terms of what they're reporting. We can compare those predictions with the predictions from different providers. And what is interesting is that some of these companies have been now publishing. So what we're doing now, and I will talk a bit later, we're now comparing the prediction of the model with actually what has been publishing. So today, the way we judge the model is actually based on the data that companies that didn't predict in the past are predicting. Now, when we constructed this first version of the model, we just used out of sample to really compare with other data providers. In terms of the construction of the model, we used log transformed data, as I just mentioned, because it's what it is normally distributed. And the predictors also log transformed. We used the technique called cross-validation. In the next slide, I will show a bit more what it is. But for cross-validation, what we did was we took the in-sample data and we partitioned it in 80% for training, 10% for validation, and 10% for testing. And I will show in the next slide when I get there how this works. But that's essentially what we have done. As I mentioned, we have this iterative procedure. So once the model was developed, we didn't just stop there. We actually looked at the biggest outliers and checked if there was any reason for having them as outliers. And if we find that there was potentially an error in the data, we just removed them and we reconstructed the model. And we found that indeed increased the model. So either we correct the data, in particular if we find that there's really something strange going on there, or else, I mean, if we find that there's an error, then we remove. If we find there's no error, I mean, it's just an outlier, of course we keep the data. But this was investigated, and quite often we found that it was the data that was wrong and needed to be corrected. So we corrected that by hand. And finally, in terms of evaluation of the model, I mean, at least for this paper, what we looked at mainly was the R-square, just comparing essentially the data points we get with what was reported, and also against what is the prediction. So on top, what you get in terms of prediction, and on the bottom what you get in terms of reported. So by comparing essentially the two, we can calculate the R-square, and you do this for the test set. So it's really as is traditionally done for machine learning models. So in the next slide, we just a bit on the cross-validation. So the way it was done, as I mentioned, the data was divided into 80% for creating the model, which is essentially every time you have you divide the data into 5, and you keep one data set as the test data, and you just you fine-tune the hyperparameters of essentially your models. For example, for the extra trees, you have to fine-tune the depth of the tree. You have to fine-tune the number of the number of trees, and so on and so forth. So all these parameters you can essentially you can fine-tune by running these a number of times and running it in this way, and you use the test data essentially for that. And then at the end, I mean, you come up with your model, and you have essentially 10% of the data which was used for the final evaluation of the data with data that has not been used to construct the model. And that's where the R-squares essentially come from. So that's a typical approach to put together machine learning models using cross-validation. Slide 10, we show what the model has done in sample using these. So what we have here on the left is scope 1 emissions. This chart, the way to see it is we start on the very left with the company with the highest emissions, and here we have the reported emissions. We're looking at the quality of the model. So we have the blue dot right on top with the company with the highest emissions, and then you just start one company at a time. So and you go all the way to the company with the lowest emissions. So you have the reported emissions scope 1 plotted one after the other for the companies ranked by scope 1 emissions. And the green dots is essentially what the model can achieve for compared to the reported emissions. And on the right, you have the same principle, the same graph for scope 2. And you can see that towards the lower emission companies, the quality of the fit is a bit less good, but in fact, that's also because we were being conservative and we were opting for the max estimation. Now do we remove that and we get a better fit in the models that are actually used in production, but for the paper and for what we were doing back then, that was the choice. So in fact, the R-squares also not as good as they could be because we had this conservative approach. Another way of visualizing this data is in slide 11. Is in the next slide. We're just looking at the differences, and we can see that they not exist. So the next slide in slide 11, we can see that they're not exactly Gaussian. As I mentioned, we can see that indeed we tend to overestimate carbon emissions, but that's also by construction here. In fact, that has finally, for the very final version of the model, we decided to remove that. So we have distributions which are a lot more Gaussian, but this is how the errors of the model are distributed. And what is also interesting to see is look at the R-squares of the model. So it's in sample, is for the final evaluation of the model. We have R-squares which indeed tend to be quite high. And what is important in particular is that they're quite high for the most important sectors, which are the ones which have the highest emissions. Because as you can see also, when it comes to the emissions of sectors, well, utilities for scope 1, which is the table on the left, is the one that is the sector with the highest emission. That comes to materials and energy and transportation. And then you can see that quite fast, the emissions fall quite significantly. So what is also more important is to have the best estimations for the companies that are going to be the biggest emitters, because that's what is more critical. And you can see that on scope 2, I mean, there's a bit less less concentrated, the emissions, but still materials, energy, utilities have, in terms of scope 2, some of the biggest emissions. You also have some of the highest R-squares in those sectors. In any case, for scope 1, I mean, we do get above 80% for the most emissive industries. And for scope 2, I mean, we get more than 75% in terms of R-square for 22 of 24 industries that we have in here.
Emilia, I think you can just go to the slides, because I don't think you're on the right one. Thank you.
Yes, sorry, yes. So I was talking about this slide, so you can see on the table on the left, utilities, energy, utilities, materials, energy, transportation, really the red ones, the most emissions. Utilities makes 40% of scope 1 emissions, materials makes 28%, and energy 19%. So you can see a lot of sectors, the emissions are quite small, relatively speaking. But we have quite high R-squares for those sectors with the highest emissions. And you can see that in terms of scope 2, I mean, is a bit less concentrated, but materials is really the highest in terms of emissions, the highest sector with 35%, and then comes energy, and then starts going down in terms of emissions. But we have quite high R-squares overall. And you can see for insurance, which was indeed one of the industries for which it was really, other models really had difficulty, particularly the other machine models from previous literature, which actually had negative R-squares, because, well, we're talking about the validation, so the test set that is used for validating the final results in terms of predictions. And you can see that here, I mean, we have quite, well, the extra trees achieve 85%. So, I mean, the elastic nets less, but quite high R-squares. Now, what we also have done in the paper, we compared, so it's the next slide, we compared with other estimates. So here, I mean, the number of companies that we're showing is limited by what is available in terms of estimates from the two data providers we use, the Bloomberg and S&P TrueCost. So on the left, you have under 8,000 companies. And on the right, for scope 2, you have just the same under 8,000 companies. And you can see there's differences between what we predict and what they predict. I mean, we've done some analysis. I mean, we do believe our numbers should be more accurate based on the analysis that we've done, but this is something also that has been done after we published the paper. But you can see again that is in particular also at lowest emissions, that for this particular model, the differences could be a bit bigger. But it's interesting that one of the other observations, you can see that in particular, as you go towards lower emissions, S&P Global TrueCost models tend to be more conservative in terms of having lower figures. Bloomberg, on the other hand, tends to be more aggressive in terms of showing higher figures. But then as you go towards higher emissions, it's Bloomberg that changes a bit less and becomes a bit more conservative, whereas S&P more or less converges a bit with what we are saying. So it's interesting to see that indeed reflects the fact that the approaches to modeling non-reported emissions are clearly not the same. So that's one of the observations that we get in terms of comparing numbers. So, I mean, often it's also a related issue. People often say, well, I mean, ESG, people don't agree on data. So, I mean, these carbon emissions, you can see the type of problems there are. And people are competing to get the best numbers, and we kind of entered that race in here with our model. And you can see there's disagreement between the data, and that is a fact anyway. Now, just a word in slide 14. So the next slide on Shapley values. So by collaborating with, essentially what happened since we published the paper, we got to be known within the BNP Paribas group in terms of what we were doing, and we started collaborating with a number of other entities in the BNP Paribas group. And in fact, the model was adopted a bit by the group, and that's why there's a second iteration and the final iteration that went into production. And one of the things that was finally came out from this work together with other people in the BNP Paribas group was the use of Shapley values, essentially to have an idea of what predictors are contributing finally to the prediction. Now, the way that works, I mean, for us, which come from a financial world, we can see it as essentially the same way that when we calculate risk, we can calculate marginal contributions to risk, which become additive because they take into account the interactions or the correlations with other variables. We can see Shapley values a bit like that. I mean, I'm not going into how they are calculated. Also, it's complicated. You need to use some approximations to calculate. You don't really get the absolutely exact Shapley value because that can be quite time consuming. But essentially what you get is something like this for each of the predictors. In fact, well, I chose one of the nicest ones, which is energy consumption. And what this tells you is that if the log of energy consumption is changing as it shows on the horizontal axis, so between -2 and 6, well, say between 0 and 4, between 0 and 4, the contribution of the log of the energy consumption is essentially linear to the final result you're going to get, in particular for scope 1. And then as you go towards the extremes, that's really where the contribution is no longer necessarily linear. And the way this is done is just by you calculate and you just iterate through your data set all the possible values when you fix the value of energy consumption. That's how you calculate these. So what you have there is a calculation of the model for everything that was possible when in your data set you had the energy consumption at a given level. Now for the energy consumption, also for scope 2, you can see it's a bit less linear. It starts, as you increase energy consumption, starts contributing less and less. So that's the type of feature you capture with the nonlinear models, which is essentially what is interesting. And although the results here show that energy consumption, a linear model would not have been that bad, you do capture this bit of nonlinearity, and some of the predictors, I mean, the nonlinear aspect can be more important than what I show here. So today, I mean, for each of the predictors, we can indeed have this type of graphs which allow us to say, well, we have a machine learning model indeed is extra T, is complicated, well, some people can say it's a black box, but this allows us to introduce transparency in the black box and say, well, but look, I mean, you have these figures because when you input your energy consumption, fine, it's almost linear relationship, except in the extremes, where it may not change that much. So that's what we can show. And that's quite important, and that's why we dropped the less accurate elastic nets in the final model. So the next slide, in terms of finally what we have today, without going into the details, because it's more or less based on what I've shown, is just some improvements in automation and just using extra trees. What we have is we actually calculating carbon emissions scope 1 and scope 2 for 32,000 companies, and that for which we didn't have reported numbers today. I mean, we have bigger numbers in terms of what is reported. As you can see here, this is August 2022. And we have numbers for which, even if we wanted, the data vendors would not give us what we would need. Now, this universe now is beyond asset management. What we use is really for the BNP Paribas group, so involves also knowing about every single company to which we lend, what are the carbon emissions. And anyway, if we were to not to do our exercise, we could only really, for a quite large number of companies, rely on estimates from Bloomberg, whether we liked it or not. Advantage of having the model is also you can tailor it more to the needs. And sometimes, for example, as we started with elastic necks and extra T's. Perhaps we want a more accurate model, and perhaps we want a more conservative model. By having our own model, we can also essentially handle all those and really tailor models. We can update it more frequently, less frequently. So that's some of the advantages of having our own production. So as conclusions, we have constructed, so in the next slide, we have constructed this model. We embarked on this project because we felt the need, we felt the pressure, and we felt the need. And so based on our contacts with academics, we found the opportunity. And we now have this model in production at the level of the group. It's at the moment for scope 1 and scope 2. We found that indeed this model, from our point of view, is more accurate than existing models. The use of machine learning is clearly a big plus. I mean, talk a lot about using machine learning in the financial industry. This is a case where we think it really allows us to produce more accurate data than non-machine learning models. And so we believe indeed can be used to predict and report on greenhouse gas emissions with greater accuracy. We mentioned scope 3, so that's something we have been looking. There's been quite a lot of going on there. And, there's also data vendors that have starting producing. So we're working on it, but it's more complicated, and we're questioning the extent to which we're going to continue working on it. So that's more or less where we are, but it's working process there. What I've said, you can find pretty much everything in this paper, which if it's not yet open, it should be open for everyone to download very soon.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you, Raoul, for the great presentation. So before I pass the floor to Jeremy, so I just wonder, so the result you presented were on 2018 carbon emissions. So yes. Now you must have 2020 or 2021. So I was just interesting to know how those results have changed or not. So a couple of questions from my side. First, in terms of the landscape, that means, do you see an improvement, and in what size, what scale regarding the reported versus non-reported in your universe? First question. And the second question is in terms of your relative performance, if you compare to third-party providers, is your model still highly competitive? Do you see third-party providers now improving their performance? Might be that they are using something similar to what you are using. So just in a nutshell, is there any changes with respect to your original paper, and what are the evolutions with respect to the landscape of carbon data?
Yes, so very good question. So as I mentioned, I mean, I was there at the beginning when this model was put together. Then, I mean, once this started being taken by the BNP Paribas group, I was much less involved, or hardly involved. So what I know, it was done, I mean, the model evolved into having all the extra trees. And in terms of what we now use to validate the quality of the model, it's actually the data that is being published by companies that were not reporting before, but for which we had predictions based on the more sophisticated version of the model. And in terms of the results, looking at those companies that have started reporting, because there's been an increase in the number of companies that report these days. And in fact, we found that indeed we were reporting the numbers quite accurately on average, and we had the most accurate predictions, in particular when we compared the numbers that other data vendors were forecasting. We didn't look at R-squares, we look at RMSEs, and we find that we do have the lowest errors in the model. So we essentially quite happy in terms of the quality of the predictions that we were producing and the models that we have created. And in the paper, the second paper that was published, those results are published, and indeed the one that seems to be closest is MSCI for scope 1, but still they have a higher error. And for scope 2, I mean, we clearly have the lowest errors. So we're quite happy in terms of that. The differences, well, they can be big for some data providers, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Jeremy, if you want to ask some questions, especially knowing that you're working on how to estimate scope 3 carbon emissions, I'm sure that you have a lot of interesting questions to ask to our comments.
Oh, I hope so. First off, thank you very much for your insight, Sir Lotte. My first question relies more on what do you do with the information you get, or that rather than how you get it. When reading your paper, you mentioned that having high GHG emissions transcribes a transition risk, which can be defined in negative cash flow from fines or operating risk from migrating to a greener competitor. My question is, has your model, which has been rolled out to the entire BNP group, is it actionable yet, in the sense that do you still rely on exclusion lists for your instruments, or has there been a threshold established, meaning that instruments with GHG emissions higher than a certain threshold will be excluded from your action?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's different types of applications. I mean, first, I mean, we do not tend to work with carbon emissions in absolute terms, because that's also not fair. I mean, if you run a big business, compared to a micro company, your emissions are obviously much larger. So we work with intensities, because I mean, it's really about the size. You have to take normalized by the size of a company in some way, because some companies are just bigger than others. So you don't want now all of a sudden just say, I'm going to solve the problem by investing in micro caps because they have really low emissions. Well, they may have low emissions, but if they're really exposed to electricity produced by coal, in terms of intensity, it can be a disaster. So we tend to use data, at least for asset management at that portfolio level, normalized by intensity. In terms of applications, I mean, we do decarbonize our portfolios, so the intensities are indeed used to make sure that our portfolios have lower emissions than the benchmarks, market capitalization weighted benchmarks, and then there's different targets. We do ourselves have also a net zero policy, so we want to decarbonize essentially what we manage for our clients. So we have targets, and this is also part of what we use in order to measure and to see if we are on the right path. And there's different approaches, and we're also going to change the way we are doing, because indeed one of the issues with the carbon emissions, what we estimate in here, is that they really what we observed typically in the past, not because I mean once the data is published, is based on reported data that was calculated for previous year. So I mean we want to be also more reactive. So we also in our approach, this is part of it, but we want to introduce a more forward-looking component. In fact, we're working on an approach which is also going to see whether the companies are actually committed and doing what they say and going on the right path. So are they aligned or are they aligning or they just simply don't care? So we're going to take something also more forward looking. But this is all part of what of the toolkit and the data sets that we need to get to that. So that's the type of usage. And this is in asset management. Now, I don't really want to talk on behalf of other entities, but they also have similar needs in terms of reporting, understanding of the exposure of the businesses in terms of reducing carbon emissions on their side, in terms of who they finance and how they finance, and detecting if they are on a good trajectory or not, to decide finally if they're going to continue to finance or not. So all that is used, and I mean, what we have here is our attempt to just do it the best we can, because unfortunately we cannot do this without data, and data, as you could see, is scarce. So we're trying to really do this in the best way we can, also by having found out that data from data vendors was not of the quality we thought it could be.
Well, about that, apparently there is some issues with the data reported by companies, well, less with scope 1 and 2 than scope 3, which has a lot of, since it's voluntary disclosures, there might be some of the 15 categories that are omitted or forgotten about. And about that, I have a quick question about your model, which has extraordinary results. And with the increase of mandatory policies and frameworks, forcing companies to disclose their emissions, namely the CSRD or the SEC 2024 in the US, do you think that the model can become sufficiently precise every time that it can beat companies which account for carbon emissions using a bottom-up approach with life cycle analysis and EIO, I think is what you mentioned in your paper?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, we would prefer that we just get reported numbers and that they are of good quality, and don't need to do that, because then we can do our job, which is manage funds rather than estimate carbon emissions. So I mean, yeah, fingers crossed that everyone starts reporting and the data is audited and it's of great quality, and we don't need this. But in the meantime, we need it. I mean, so the data is not there yet. And anyway, there's errors in data. Maybe at some stage the model will be used. I mean, the model on our side, the way it's used, is in particular used to challenge what we get from the data vendors. And well, that's already what we find is quite a good use for the model, but to really make sure that we understand the data that we have. But I mean, if everyone starts reporting, even better. Now, what you say on scope 3 is true, and scope 3 is not necessarily going to be reported in the same way as scope 1 and scope 2. Indeed, one of the issues also scope 3 is that it can be significantly larger than scope 1 and scope 2, but also can have double counting. So there's quite a lot of issues with scope 3, but it's clearly something that we're going to start using, and we're going to start using in this year, later in the year. So there's quite a lot of work on scope 3. We did start by constructing some models, but we did not find results as good as for scope 1 and scope 2. And also there's a question how we do it, because I mean, well, we have all these components, so you estimate all the components, which is not really good, because in some cases also you don't have data, as you say. I mean, when you say scope 3, you don't really know how many of the components have been used even when it's reported. So, I mean, those are some of the difficulties. So we had come up with some approaches like just reducing the number of components and trying to work with that. But all that kind of is a bit, well, I'm not working on that. And from what I know, also there's some new data sets that have been produced by some data vendors, which are being analyzed also quite carefully. So there's work going on, and there's still a possibility that we have a model which will help us understand scope 3 and report and use scope 3. But it's work in progress, and it is indeed much more complicated. And one of the things also that we've been trying is to use supply chain data, but again, supply chain data, the quality is not at the level we really wanted it to be. So it's an avenue that also we started, does help a bit, but then, I mean, it's a bit incomplete. So we also working on supply chain as a way maybe to get and solve the problem, help solving the problem.
Okay. Thank you very much for your answer. I see there are some questions in the Q&A. Maybe we could.
Yeah, so yeah, I propose effectively that so there are two questions. I will pick the first, and Jeremy, you will pick the second, if you're okay.
Sure.
I think it's more just to clarify with respect to your paper in your presentation. So the first question is, I wonder, as your model is used to forecast unreported data, how can you assess its performance out of sample? So just to explain, in fact, how you compute the out of sample error or performance, if you can just develop on it.
So I mean, the way it was used and the figures that are reported in the paper are essentially based on typical cross-validation approaches, where you just reserve a final bit of data for the evaluation at the very end. That's really how the R-squares were calculated. And as I mentioned, what we switched from since the paper, we started doing it differently because we've been doing this for a while, and we had indeed predictions which have been put together already over, well, the paper just appeared in 2022, but it's based on work done 2018 and for emissions then. So, I mean, we could use the model to generate predictions for companies that in the meantime started reporting. And so in the second paper, that's really what we're looking at. And we believe that's really a lot more powerful, because indeed, I mean, we had a model, and now we can really look, okay, predicted some figures the company published. So how good was our prediction? And that's, as I say, where we see that our model is generating the lowest errors in terms of comparing what was the prediction in the past and what we're getting now for that particular date for a company that in the meantime started reporting. So we're putting a lot more focus on looking at those numbers than even at the numbers that we published in the paper that indeed show the quality is good, but okay, it's based on a small sample that we keep, or 10% of the data set that we keep on the side, just to, after doing all the construction of the model, really just do the predictions for those 10% of companies and estimate R-square. So we moved away from that, and we're looking really at the errors based on reported data that was reported ex post.
Thank you.
I think we missed a question from the gentleman, but it's in two parts. So the second question is there some types of assets or sectors which are more challenging to capture from data vendors, for instance, private equity or infrastructure? Also, how do you deal with missing data, imputation before modeling?
Yes, so on the first question, indeed, I mean, on the universe, that a lot of the companies that were missing, indeed, they corresponded to private assets. In terms of missing data, I mean, we in the paper we kept it relatively simple. We just pushed. I mean, whenever there was a data point missing, I used to look at the sets and the type of data sets. Also in the paper we have the stats. But essentially, we just pushed previous numbers that had already been reported, and that essentially we managed to complete the entire data sets. So in terms of what was missing, it was not really that much, and we managed to complete the data sets just by pushing for numbers that had been published in the past. So that's, well, it's an approach. I mean, there's potentially other approaches. When we did the paper, in fact, on the production model, I'm not sure if they did something more sophisticated, but when we constructed the paper, the model that is in the paper I'm talking about, that's essentially what we did.
Okay, you pick the last one, Jeremy?
Sure, of course. Is carbon offsetting complicating the estimates or taking into account to some extent?
Carbon offsetting, no. I mean, as far as I know, I mean, I don't see why we. No, to be honest, I'm not sure if we used it, tried it out as a variable. I don't know if we have enough data to actually use it as a variable. We didn't. I mean, would we get better data by inputting carbon offsetting? I don't know. I mean, to be honest, no, I don't have an answer to that question. Now, would it make a difference? Don't really know. I mean, I don't see why it would make a big difference. But well, what we can make is a company that is prepared to pay and buy and offset carbon in one way or the other and continue to emit. I mean, still have higher emissions. So for us, I mean, still be reported. I mean, here we're not saying that the company has these emissions and then is buying these carbon offsets, and so we just. I mean, in fact, we don't take carbon offsetting in our decarbonization efforts in the funds. So if the company is doing okay, it's excellent, but the number is still the number. So that's it.
I have a question. Did you look, so you already give an answer, the private public, but beside that, did you look to the characteristics of the company that report versus the one that do not report? Are they different? Are they similar? So there are any specific features?
The one feature that is really just obvious and comes out from the data very, very easily is that large cap companies publish more.
For sure.
Then, I mean, no, I don't remember any other features really being common. And that large cap companies published is also understandable. It's also a general bias on ESG because, I mean, they have more means to hire people and to have people focusing on this as you become smaller and smaller. I mean, the costs of having people just calculating these things or doing this, I mean, get higher. So for as long as you can avoid, if you don't think that is going to have an immediate benefit on your business, you try to avoid. So that's the one bias, and you could see it in the numbers that we showed right at the beginning. When you go to the 3,000 larger companies, you already have almost 50% reporting, and if you look at the entire universe, you can see that it's most smaller companies that do not report.
Okay, so I think we are close to the end. So just want to thank first Jeremy. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your result, Jeremy, that you will send to Raoul. And obviously, I want to thank Raoul for sharing his expertise. So great talk. Thank you very much, Raoul. It's a pleasure. So I just want to take a moment to announce that we will have a next speaker series. This will be this month too, on the 18th of April. We will continue our journey on the future of finance, and we will be happy to host Alex Edmonds from LBS that will talk about ESG and more precisely, do corporation need a purpose? So thank you very much. Thank you, Raoul.
Welcome. Pleasure.
Merci beaucoup. À bientôt.
À bientôt.
See you. Bye.
So,
Thanks, Raoul. Thanks, Jeremy.
thanks.